So how many manuscripts are we dealing with? New Testament scholars are faced with an embarrassment of riches, which is unlike what scholars of classical literature ever have to face. It's just a huge disparity. Among the Greek manuscripts that we have today, the ones that still exist, the numbers come to about 5,824. Now, these are not just small fragments of manuscripts, although there are some that are like that. The average-sized Greek New Testament manuscript is more than 450 pages long. There are 2.6 million pages of handwritten Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. 2.6 million pages. The New Testament was translated early on in the 2nd century into Latin, and we have more manuscripts in Latin than we actually do in Greek today, which is astounding, of the New Testament. We also have the New Testament translated into other ancient languages, again beginning in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th century, into Armenian and Arabic and Old Church Slavonic, Georgian, Gothic, Syriac, Coptic, a number of different languages. We're not exactly sure how many manuscripts there are in these other ancient versions, but it's at least 5,000 and probably as high as 10,000. In fact, a number of people put it as much, much higher than that, but these are conservative estimates. This means that we have between 20 and 25,000 New Testament manuscripts written by hand before the time of the printing press. That's a pretty good sized number of witnesses, you know. Now, if you had a magic wand and you could wipe all these manuscripts out in one fell swoop, the New Testament text would still not be left without a witness. And that's because of people known as church fathers, the bishops, and the elders and priests and pastors and deacons who wrote homilies, sermons, commentaries. And these church fathers did not have the gift of brevity. And consequently, we have an institute in Boiron, Germany that has been cataloging what the church fathers had to say about the text of the New Testament, how many times they quoted it. A few years ago, the quotations from the New Testament by the church fathers came to more than 1 million. Think about that. There's only 7,941 verses, less than 8,000 verses in the New Testament, and yet it's quoted more than 1 million times. That's just, to me, that's just phenomenal, astounding. I don't know how to even conceive of that. The entire New Testament would be virtually reproduced many, many times over just from the quotations of the church fathers. Well, how does this compare to other ancient literature? The average classical Greek writer has less than 20 copies of his works still in existence. Less than 20 copies. In fact, that's a very, very high estimate. Most of them have 1 or 2 copies. If you stacked up these 20 copies, they'd be about 4 feet high, right about here. How high would the stack of New Testament manuscripts be? Well, let's do a comparison. You know, I've got to kind of make it a triple stack. Maybe it's that much. Okay, yeah, a little bit more. No, I think it's more than that. We should keep going. It's getting better. And that is as much as I could do in PowerPoint. Multiply that New Testament stack by 8, and it's more than 1 mile high. More than 1 mile high of manuscripts for the New Testament compared to the average classical author, about 4 feet high. We have so many more manuscripts for the New Testament than anything else in the ancient world. It's absolutely an embarrassment of riches. And so this is a radical difference. If it were based just on the number of manuscripts, if someone said, I'm really skeptical about whether somebody ever, by the name of Jesus Christ, lived, which there are people who are saying such really ludicrous statements, then we should say, you know, you're right. I'm not sure he did, but I'm not sure if Julius Caesar ever lived, or Augustus, or Alexander the Great, all these people, because the evidence for them is so minuscule compared to what we have of the New Testament. It's a huge difference. And so when you have skeptics that are talking about the New Testament that way, they're only talking about the New Testament. They have never thought about this other ancient literature and reflecting on what that would be like. If I'm going to be skeptical about the New Testament and I apply that skepticism to other ancient Greco-Roman literature, guess what? We immediately go back into the Dark Ages. We've eclipsed all knowledge in the last 500 years. Well, it's not just the number of manuscripts that we're dealing with. It's also the date of the manuscripts. The average classical author doesn't have any copies of his writings until half a millennium after he wrote. There were so few of them, they wore out, and then we're waiting at least 500 years before we see the average classical author's writings, and then just fragments. What about the New Testament? How long are we waiting for that? Decades. Not even a century. Maybe only 1 decade for part of it. Well, has the Bible been translated and retranslated so many times that we don't know what it originally said? Here's another way to think about this. In 1611, when the King James Bible was produced, the New Testament was based essentially on 7 manuscripts, the oldest of which went back to the 11th century. Now, 402 years later, we have nearly 1,000 times as many manuscripts, some of which go back almost 1,000 years earlier than what the King James translation was based on. So that when you look at the resurrection of Christ, you look at his deity, his virgin birth, salvation by faith, salvation by grace, the Trinity, any essential doctrines, not a single one is impacted by any of these viable variants. All these cardinal beliefs are secure. Not one is affected by it. In fact, let me quote from that skeptic. We've already mentioned him, Bart Ehrman. In the appendix to his book, Misquoting Jesus, he was asked by the editors, why do you believe these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy to be in jeopardy based on the scribal errors you discovered in the biblical manuscripts? His answer? Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. Read it. Meditate on it. Let it get into your life. And let it change your life. This year, make a commitment to read the Scriptures.